This is thinkenergy, the podcast that helps you better understand the fast-changing world of energy through conversations with game changers, industry leaders, and influencers. So join me, Dan Seguin, as I explore both traditional and unconventional facets of the energy industry. Hey everyone, welcome back. There's a great analogy I read recently that compared future-proofing the electricity grid to Wayne Gretzky. And since this is our 99th episode, woohoo, it just seems fitting that we make our reference to the great one. What made Wayne Gretzky the greatest hockey player of all times was not his speed or the uncanny accuracy of his shots, but rather his ability to predict where the puck was going to be an instant before it arrived. Utilities, like Wayne Gretzky, have the ability to anticipate events and predict patterns that can make them more prepared for extreme weather events. As a utility, planning and predicting the future is part of our DNA. And as we all prepare to meet greenhouse gas reduction targets set by the feds, provincial, and municipal governments, we are seeing a lot of future planning happening to make the electricity system as clean and as resilient as possible. And part of that is predicting what the future will look like, from what energy sources will power our electricity supply, but also what kind of challenges like electrification and threats like extreme weather we will face. So here's today's big question. How can utilities earn customer confidence as they transition towards an electrified grid that can also withstand unpredictable weather to safely and reliably deliver energy? Today's guest is Guillaume Paradis. As the Chief Electricity Distribution Officer at Hydro Ottawa, Guillaume is responsible for planning, design, operations, constructions, and maintenance of our nation's capital electrical power distribution system. In his role, Guillaume leads a team directly accountable for ensuring the safe, efficient, and reliable delivery of electricity to Hydro Ottawa customers. Guillaume has over a decade of industry experience in progressive leadership roles ranging from research program management to distribution planning, asset management, design, and construction. Thanks for joining us on the show today, Guillaume.
Thanks for having me.
You've been in the industry for more than a decade now. What's been the biggest change or shift you've witnessed?
So what I'd say has been the most significant change over that time period is that we've actually gone from talking about very exciting things and future focused opportunities. So we've gone from talking about them to actually getting to implement them. So some of the things that were on the horizon 10 years ago and 15 years ago, in fact, were related to electric vehicles, the proliferation of battery storage technology, the development of the smart grid. And over that period of time, through those conversations, we've actually been able to shift the industry to a place where we're actually delivering on some of those promises. So that's very, very exciting. It's a massive challenge for everyone involved, but it unlocks a whole series of possibilities that when I started my career, we were only talking and thinking about.
Okay, what does future-proofing the electricity grid really mean? What kind of plans and predictions are you making to help the grid withstand climate change?
So future-proofing is an interesting one because, ultimately all of, your success depends on your ability to forecast, and forecasting currently with the changing landscape, with the pace at which policy is being updated, refreshed, and modified is quite challenging. So we've gone from an environment where you could look at decades worth of data, use a little bit of economic information and forecast, and combine those things into what would turn out to be a pretty useful and fairly accurate prediction of what your system would be required to deliver, So we've gone from that to an environment where, in a matter of sometimes months, the underlying basis for your predictions has totally been changed, and you're having to revisit your assumptions from, frankly, a quarter to the next. So future proofing right now, in my mind, is about keeping an eye out for what's coming. So being able to anticipate what's ahead, being able to stay abreast of all the trends, making what I would call incremental adjustments to our practices today that ensure that if and when the future, more specifically crystallizes, we can take advantage of the opportunities and we're not having to redo too much work, but also without betting too much on one outcome where we may not have the certainty of what's ahead. So, that's true when you look at the full landscape, and specifically when we're looking at the predictions around climate change. It's about, at a minimum, being very responsive to the more recent events. So, using that to update your predictions. And recently, unfortunately, with respect to climate, we've seen what would have been deemed, 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 100 year events occur at a frequency that far exceeds, what predictions would have called for. And we have to recognize that as being the new trend, despite not having the benefit of 100 years of events in that new paradigm that we find ourselves in. So, from a climate standpoint, I think we have to be a little farther out in expecting that recent data points actually represent the new reality, as opposed to relying on the longer trend that we would like to count on, which is 50, 100 years or beyond. So, from a climate standpoint, at this point, our assumption is, what's happened recently looks a lot more like what's expected to happen to us in the next few years. And in fact, we're looking to build a little bit of contingency or buffer into our predictions, assuming that it might get a little worse.
Now, why does future proofing the grid go hand in hand with electrification and clean energy?
So electrification and clean energy come down to, in my view, increasing our society's resilience and dependence on our electricity infrastructure. So, for many years now, many decades, the electricity system has been the underpinning of our modern society. But even more so, as we move more of our energy use to the electricity system, it becomes paramount to ensure that the infrastructure we have is able to support and maintain, with a high level of redundancy, that modern lifestyle where more of what we do is electrified. Clean energy, in its various forms, supports our ability to electrify more of our activities, but also from a planning standpoint, introduces a bit of a new challenge in terms of intermittency. And so our ability to have an underlying asset base, distribution system or transmission system that is highly redundant and highly secure to enable and support that use of renewable energy is critical. And so that's where future proofing is really about, ensuring that the bet we're making as a society, which is electrifying to improve the outlook on our climate change objectives, is actually possible going forward.
Guillaume, I've got a follow-up question here. What does a self-healing grid mean?
In a nutshell, self-healing is about leveraging technology and automation to ensure that when an issue occurs, whether it be a failure or an externality like a tree, impacting our infrastructure, we use that technology, that automation, to most rapidly restructure and rearrange our distribution system to minimize the impact of those events. So it's really about leveraging automation, rapid communication we now have access to, using the computational power that is also available to us, and letting those tools make the preliminary decision on how best to restore power before there's a human interaction that comes in to take care of the final step. So really, if you think about it and how far we've come in the last 20 years with computer power and communication tools, it's really bring the latest and the best of those technologies to bear on how we restore power to our customers.
After the May derecho, a lot of people were asking why utilities don't bury all overhead lines. What's your answer to that, Guillaume?
So yeah, it comes up every time there's a storm, and it's perfectly understandable. And I think there's a couple things that come into play when we think about, what or how best to deliver power to our customers. Certainly, we've been talking about redundancy and an underground system when it comes to certain types of climate-related events like large storms or windstorms. Introduce a certain level of security that exceeds what is possible with an overhead system. But the other very important element as we think about electrification going forward is the element of cost and affordability of power. And, just from a comparison standpoint, the basic math, when evaluating underground alternatives to overhead systems is about a 10-to-1 cost ratio. So certainly when we look at, where best to invest dollars and how best to bring power to communities, that cost component is factored in and becomes a consideration, particularly when you look at lower density areas or farther away areas from production centers. It becomes a costly proposition. Now, what we're looking to do going forward is we see undergrounding as a strategic tool in improving our climate resilience. And so we're going to look at certain corridors, perhaps, or certain targeted investments to underground infrastructure to try to get the most value possible for our customers as we plan for an elevated climate challenge in the future. But that consideration around cost is significant. And finally, what I'd say as well is, your ability to restore power when there's a problem with overhead infrastructure is far greater than it is when an underground system fails. And so in addition to that cost component, the ability to restore power quickly when there is a problem is higher with an overhead infrastructure.
At the beginning of the last century, it was the Industrial Revolution. This century is shaping up to be an electrical revolution. How confident are you, Guillaume, about the grid's capacity as more and more people electrify their cars and eventually their homes?
So how confident? I would say very confident. And that's not to minimize the scale of the challenge ahead of us. You're correct. We're now proposing to essentially, completely shift the dynamics around electricity in a matter of, I would like to say decades, but it's essentially a decade at this point. And so it's a very complex challenge from an engineering standpoint and a planning standpoint. But I've seen how the conversation and the thinking has evolved over the last 10, 15 years in our industry. I've seen the technologies that are being brought forward as tools to be leveraged to enable that transition to a more electric future and, the significant load growth that will come with that. So I think we have the tools. We need to maintain a high level of awareness and adaptability in, facing what's ahead of us. We can't fall back on old habits or, make excuses when we have solutions we want to implement and we know we need to implement to enable that electrified future. But I think we will get there, and I've seen all sorts of signs pointing to that possibility. And it's going to come down to, once again, making the most of all the tools we have. So we talked about technology earlier. We're going to have to leverage technology to manage how electric vehicles are charged and when and in what parts of the city, and how best to leverage the existing infrastructure to do that, because we know we can't just build or double the size of our electric infrastructure to accommodate that growth. So we're going to have to be more refined. We're going to have to leverage all the tools available to us, including distributed energy resources. But I think we will get there. And I like what I'm seeing from all the stakeholders across the industry in thinking and adapting to that new reality.
Here's another follow-up question. What would you say to those who are worried about reliability and power outages?
I would say that's our main focus. And so it's completely normal to have some concerns in a context where more of our lives become dependent on the electricity system. But on our end, from an electricity industry standpoint, reliability has been forever essentially, the focus of our energy and our attention. And now we all understand that we need to elevate the reliability standards that have been developed over the last decades. And so we have, once again, certain tools we can leverage to do that. So again, not to say it's not significant. We have to go from, what has been a 99.998% availability to something even closer to 100%, because we know our customers depend on our infrastructure more than ever. But we're working on that, and we're going to bring in some tools that will help us support that outcome. And certainly, we talked about automation, but things like battery storage becoming more prevalent, within the landscape, including the batteries of electric vehicles over time, will be one of those examples of new tools that we can try to leverage to deliver that elevated level of reliability that our customers will expect and our society will need.
Okay. Thanks, Guillaume. There will be power outages. We can't avoid that. Knowing that, what are some of the things customers could or should consider doing to be better prepared?
Yeah, so that's another interesting question with respect to what we've seen in the last few years. So even just through some of the climate related events that we've experienced, longer duration outages related to tornadoes or the derecho more recently. One of the basic things that everyone is encouraged to do, and we try to promote, is developing a plan for the household, right? Or for your business if you're a commercial customer. But think about what things look like from your perspective in the event of an outage of various durations. Like, the basic exercise would be to think about something of short duration, say 2 hours or less, then looking at something a bit more prolonged, like 6 hours, and then going to the next step of saying, what happens if it's more than 24 hours? And, if you go to our website and the website of, many of our peer utilities, most offer a set of resources around how to build a toolkit to be able to remain safe and function through certain duration outages. And then, of course, if you want to go beyond that for certain critical customers, and that conversation is ongoing and everyone's mind's already been turned to that, but looking at other alternatives like on-site generation, energy storage, generators, of course, being the traditional option, but looking to secure some critical processes with on-site generation where possible. So building resilience is something that we've worked on, for decades through our infrastructure investments, of course, but working with customers, and more so than ever, again, as we electrify many more aspects of our lives, we need to ensure that everyone appreciates and recognizes what may be required if power was to, for hopefully a very short amount of time, not be available.
Now, what kind of planning and predictions are you making for the short, mid, and long term when it comes to electrification?
So the short term is probably the most interesting element now because it's been a little difficult to figure out exactly when things would land. So what we're seeing today, and that's ongoing now, is that certainly many customers are are actively looking at reducing their impact in terms of carbon footprint, and they're looking at doing that through electrification. And so we're seeing a lot of activity where customers choose to fuel switch, which would be essentially moving away from using carbon intensive energy resources for things like e-heating, and then leveraging our infrastructure to support that. So when that happens at a campus level or for commercial customers, that can be a significant growth in the demand on the electricity system. So we're fairly able to project what that looks like, and it's been happening at a good pace. On the electric vehicle adoption side of things, we've been monitoring for over a decade now. We've been, doing some modeling, some predictions. We've worked with, external stakeholders to put together studies that would help us understand the impact. The thing that's been challenging, certainly over the last 2 years, is that there's now a clear gap between the market demand with or for electric vehicles and what manufacturers and the supply chains are able to make available to that market. So figuring out the exact timing has become a little more challenging, where we would have expected to see, a very steady growth, but a significant growth that would eventually turn into sort of a complete shift to electric vehicle purchases. Whereas it's taken a bit longer, I think, to occur than we would have frankly hoped for, but also expected. It's gotten us or given us a bit more time, I suppose, to plan for it. But certainly from an electrification standpoint and the predictions that we're making, we're seeing electric vehicles being sort of pervasive across our distribution system. It'll occur over a certain number of years, but we will have electric vehicle charging occur all over service territory. And certainly from a fleet standpoint, once again, as soon as some of the manufacturers manage to ramp up their capacity to produce vehicles, we're expecting to see more and more fleet operators move their entire operation to electric vehicles. And so we're preparing for that as well.
Now, Guillaume, tell me, what keeps you up at night? Then talk to me about what gives you hope.
So what still keeps me up at night, and I think that's just a virtue of the environment and the industry that we're in, is the safety of our team and frankly anyone who interacts with our infrastructure. So that's something that we easily forget in our society, considering how ubiquitous electricity is. It's just the sheer power that electricity represents, and how close in proximity it comes to many people. Certainly our workforce, physically interacts with that infrastructure every day. And so ensuring that they remain safe at all times is critical. But it's the same for our customers and anyone who comes close to the electricity infrastructure. And so that's first and foremost. I think it's just, a reality of what we do, distributing electricity. But certainly just the general pace of change is interesting. I wouldn't say it keeps me up at night because I'm worried. It keeps me up at night because it's exciting and there's so much possibilities that come with what's ahead, to a degree that we've frankly never seen in our industry. And so it's just a completely exciting time to be part of the electricity industry, and we just got to make sure that we do everything we can to leverage what's coming for the benefit of our customers and to power our community. But there are very much worse things to be kept up at night by, and I think it's just a lot of energy, literally, I suppose, coming to all of us, around the organization and the industry. Well, hope is, I think we have, so many bright colleagues, so many people looking at what's, uh, ahead and what's upon us, that we're uniquely positioned to help, our all societies across the globe deliver on, what is, the generational challenge of climate change. So it's not often that you're part of an industry that can have such a significant impact on such a large problem. And so to be right in the middle of it and having a key role in enabling the aspiration of our entire society is really exciting. And having the chance to take tangible and real concrete actions to get us all there is fantastic. So the hope comes from the energy of everyone involved and the talent of everyone involved and the passion that they bring to solving this massive, massive challenge that we have ahead of us.
Moving on here, what role does Hydro Ottawa or utilities in general have when it comes to delivering solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
So I think the unique perspective that we bring, so certainly electrifying, period, right? So we're an alternative to dirtier sources, particularly here in Ontario, where we can still count on an electricity system that is very significantly supplied by renewable energy resources. So we're sort of a platform for greenhouse gas reduction just by virtue of electrification. So that is a significant role. And even more importantly, we also have an opportunity to be direct partners with industries, stakeholders, businesses, commercial actors who are actually trying to reduce their greenhouse gases footprint and impact. And so we're part of the conversation. And what we do differently than other businesses is we think and plan in decades and in windows of 25 and 50 years. And so we've been here 100 years. We're expecting to be here many hundred more. And so we have that long-term perspective that we can bring to the table when engaging with other stakeholders who maybe think more on a sort of business case level in terms of 3 and 5 year paybacks. We're actually able to bring in that long-term perspective to inform their decision making. So it's pretty unique, frankly, and we're also in many cases in a position where we're trusted advisors. So there has been that trust built over decades of being reliable and available. And so we're seen as almost impartial in the process of electrifying and reducing greenhouse gases. And so again, we can bring that perspective to bear when supporting our customers and making those decisions and enabling those objectives of more sustainable activities.
Sorry about this, Guillaume, but I've got a follow-up question. What are some of the initiatives that Hydro Ottawa is doing to help customers in this area?
So we have essentially the full inventory of initiatives. So from a customer standpoint, we work with them at the facility level. We have, our key account representatives. We're sort of their energy advisors on demand. And so, that is a direct line between customers and all the portfolios and all the options that are available in the industry. So that's big because it's almost working with them from the inception of their plans to try to bring them to that future of a lower carbon footprint. And so we're very active in that space. From an energy standpoint and an energy system standpoint, we see our responsibility as being the local enabler of local renewable energy resources and a more efficient use of energy, in our community and in the communities that we serve. And so we're working with industry stakeholders, particularly regulatory agencies, in better informing their approach to enabling those resources to make sure that when customers approach us with their solar generation project or with their battery storage project, we find the best way to make that investment work for them financially, but also for our community from a greenhouse gas standpoint. And so we have a very important role in sort of acting as an interface between, our constituents and the regulatory agencies that govern what we do. And that's fundamental to making that green future possible, because we're essentially, upending an entire regulatory framework and an entire industry paradigm on the fly as people make those decisions to invest differently. And so that advisor role is critical, that advocacy role is critical. And then, more specifically, we have a wide variety of programs, all available in great detail on our website to help customers think through the decisions that they're making with respect to energy.
Now, what are your thoughts on distributed energy resources? What kind of challenges or opportunities do they pose?
Not only a great opportunity, but a necessary piece of that puzzle coming together with respect to electrifying and proceeding with that energy transition that we've all embarked on. In that, going forward with the combination of a growing demand for electricity and some of the challenges brought about by climate change, we'll need to be able to leverage energy resources closer to where the demand actually exists. And distributed energy resources are sort of the elementary building block that will allow us to do that, where by having a generation closer to our customers within our community here in Ottawa, for example, and in Castleman, we'll be able to ensure that we're not reliant on power coming from, hundreds of kilometers away somewhere across the province. And that under more scenarios, contingency or otherwise, we're able to leverage what's here to ensure that our customers stay powered through whatever may come. And so the DERs, both in meeting capacity requirements going forward and meeting resilience expectations, will be essential. And so, once again, they, in terms of scaling up to, many thousands within Ottawa, they represent a pretty significant engineering challenge in rethinking our control systems, our, engineering decisions, but they're a necessary and important building block, and therefore much larger of an opportunity than they are a threat. And we just need to spend the next few years continuing to evolve our ability to leverage those in real time to meet our future objectives.
Okay, Guillaume, we always end our interviews with some rapid fire questions. We've got a few for you. Are you ready?
Okay, we'll give it a shot.
Okay. What are you reading right now?
So, and I'm not sure if the timing of this conversation will matter, but certainly leading up to Remembrance Day, I sort of tend to go back to at least one book, related to war and the impacts of war. And so I've gone back into reading Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman. So that's sort of one of my favorite books about the start of the First World War. Just very well written. And every time I go back to it, just inspired by the quality of the storytelling. But I have this bad habit of reading multiple books at the same time, which typically means takes me forever to get through them. I've started Dawn of Everything, or The Dawn of Everything, which is a complicated but very interesting reevaluation of how modern Enlightenment thinking has evolved in Europe through the influence of some of the North American First Nations. So, very interesting topic there. And also reading an old classic in Letters from a Stoic by Seneca. When I managed to not fall asleep at 12:30 each night. But those are the three books that are on my night table right now.
Now, what would you name your boat if you have one, or maybe do you have one?
I do not, and I would let my kids name it. And so I expect it would be called something related to Paw Patrol or the latest show that they're on these days. But I would certainly not shoulder that responsibility, and I would ask my kids to decide what the name should be.
Who is someone that you admire, Guillaume?
I'm going to stay on the same theme with that one. And I think I have to say I admire my wife. And I do because I get to watch her in action every single day. And I see how she tackles problems and she multitasks and makes problems go away that I couldn't quite wrap my head around. And so her relentless energy or determination that she applies to everything she does is really a big inspiration for me. So, surely there are others, in our history or otherwise that could be inspirations, but no one resonates in my life quite to the degree that my wife does.
Okay. What is the closest thing to real magic that you've witnessed?
Hey, that's a tricky one. And I think not to be the engineering type talking about science here, but I think just there's two extremes. There's either the technology that we've managed to develop, and one of the ones I think of occasionally is the computers and the chips and the microprocessors we've been able to develop, and just the sheer scale and the complexity that we've been able to create there. Otherwise, things like CRISPR for genetic splicing, I just still can't quite wrap my head around how that's possible. But we're able to do things with DNA now that are just, stuff of science fiction 20 years ago. Anything to do with space exploration and deploying, telescopes in space or launching probes to Mars. I still don't understand how we managed to do that without something failing more often than it does. And otherwise, the other extreme I would say is just nature, right? And that's exactly what we're all working on today across the globe, is recognizing that what we have, around us, our planet, is just beyond amazing and almost incomprehensible in complexity, and we have a responsibility to take care of that. But I think whenever I have the chance of stepping out of the city and just looking around at nature for a few minutes, you have to kind of be reminded of how unlikely it all seems that something so complex, so beautiful would come together. And so I think in the real world, those things are as close as we can get to magic, really.
Okay, this is an interesting one, Guillaume. What has been the biggest challenge to you personally since the pandemic began?
That's a tricky one to think through, because there's been so much that seems to have happened over the last 24 months or now 30 months of the pandemic. I would say just having to constantly adapt without what seemed for a while a real frame of reference, right? So if you take yourself back to the early days of the pandemic in particular, it just seemed like every other week we would be learning new things about how the pandemic would work and how forecasts looked as to how we might get out of that situation. And so, I'm someone who loves change in general, but even for me, in those early days, it just seemed a little bit unsettling to feel like every other week you had to rethink a lot of your decisions, a lot of your planning, a lot of the ways in which you thought you could protect yourself, your colleagues, and your family. And so just having to do that on an ongoing basis for an extended period of time like that was very, very, very challenging. And so I'd probably put that as the biggest challenge. But obviously, everything else that flowed from there with respect to our society, our friends and family, our colleagues, that was just a very, very unique situation to work through in general, right?
We've all been watching a lot more Netflix and TV lately. What is your favorite movie or your favorite show?
So I watch just about anything that comes up that I can sort of sit through for more than 15 minutes. That's sort of the test now. We've all watched so much TV over the last few years that if something can capture your attention for 15 minutes, it's probably a good sign. I always, and that might be a boring answer, but I always end up going back to, one of the classics in Seinfeld. So, you look at what's available and, sometimes you just don't have the energy to start something new. And I just go back to it. I found it's aged fairly well. Some of the humor in there is quite timeless. And so it's sort of like a comforting blanket almost at this point to just go back to a couple old Seinfeld episodes.
Lastly, sir, what's exciting you about your industry right now?
I mean, I've said it a few times already, but just the opportunity to be in the middle of all that change, like it's such an important time in our society's evolution. I would not want to be on the sidelines of watching that unfold. And I think, being so centrally positioned to help us all achieve those really big aspirations we have with respect to climate and the environment, I think that's great, right? And we have the tools, we have the energy, we have, everyone willing, and so we just have to do it. So I think, it's such a source of inspiration and energy that I couldn't ask for more, frankly. Electricity was always important, and I was always something that made our industry very intriguing and interesting. But that has been taken to a whole new level in the last little while, and for the foreseeable future, that there's going to be an endless supply of energy for all of us to solve those big problems.
Well, Guillaume, we've reached the end of another episode of the Think Energy podcast. If our listeners wanted to learn more about you and our organization, how could they connect?
So certainly, go to our website. We've just launched a brand new website for our group of companies. I believe it's under the name of poweras1.com. Otherwise, our Hydro Ottawa website, of course. I wouldn't encourage you to find out more about me. I'm not that important, but check out the resources we have on our website. Our organization in particular is doing all sorts of novel and cool things, whether it be across Portage Power, Envari, Hibu Networks, or Hydro Ottawa Limited. So check out what we have there and reach out. You'll see all sorts of channels on there that you can use to engage with us. We're actively looking for everyone's input as we think about the future of energy. And so please come forward with whatever creative solutions you have, and I assure you we'll consider them.
Again, Guillaume, merci beaucoup. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you had a lot of fun. Cheers.
It was great. Thank you, Dan, for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Think Energy podcast. And don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review wherever you're listening. And to find out more about today's guest or previous episodes, visit thinkenergypodcast.com. I hope you'll join us again next time as we spark even more conversations about the energy of tomorrow.